So hi and welcome to this session on cloudification of your file servers. My name is Alex and with me I got Emil. Emil?
Hi, I'm Emil Cabot, Cloud and Data Center Management MVP based out of Calgary, Alberta, Canada. I'm a blogger on checkyourlogs.net.
And my name is Alex. I'm a Windows and Devices for IT MVP and based out of Norway, Bergen. I do a lot of OneDrive for Business folder migration. And that's pretty much what we're going to talk about today.
Awesome.
So what's your take on local file servers, Emil?
The quicker I can get away from them, the better. The last probably 5 years, Alex, myself and Dave and the team at Tricon Elite Consulting have been very, very aggressively migrating on-prem implementations of on-prem data center servers to storage spaces direct. So as we migrate, traditional racks of space, of compute, and storage down to 1 and 2 node clusters, we're doing a drastic reduction of that on-prem data, and we want to get these things up to the cloud for primary storage because at the end of the day, it's cheaper to store it up in Azure than it is for me to store it in my data center.
So what kind of return on investment should your typical customers find? What kind of budget post could they eliminate by migrating to SharePoint Online and
Well, the beauty about utilizing Azure solutions, especially for things like storage, is that the consumption will grow and decrease based upon your usage. So as the more data you need to store, of course, obviously your costs are going up. I mean, data's not free, but you don't have to plan for your maximum amount of storage right out of the gate, right? So when we're in traditional data center technologies, when we're going out to scope a file server or scope a new SQL server, what we do is we look for what is the worst possible load that we're going to put on this realistically over the next 7 years. And then that high point becomes what we need to scope our entire solution with. So out of the gate, we end up having this big beefy server with like 2% consumption.
That's one take, and a lot of end users in your company typically don't relate to those kind of solutions. They see a network drive connected to their Explorer, right?
Exactly.
They have a shared folder for their HR department, they have a shared folder for their IT department, and they have a home folder. What kind of user experience is it for the end user?
At the beginning, it's typically okay, especially now because a lot of the user community has become adjusted to using network drives to store their files. They realize that you've got to store the important stuff at least on the network drive because that's where it's protected.
Yeah.
But what I find more often is as that progresses and as your file server gets more and more full, I'm sure you've noticed when you map a network drive, it shows how much storage is left. And as if you're talking about a 20 terabyte volume, if you're using, 16 terabytes, it's starting to look pretty full.
Yeah.
You may still have 4 terabytes left, but it looks full. So it actually generates calls to the help desk because the end users think that their hard drive is full.
Yeah, and sometimes if you have a shared folder or you're sharing your home folder without any limitations, it's like, I haven't stored anything, but it's still full.
Right.
Right. So, what's your take on customers that already been migrated to OneDrive for Business?
There's a couple of really, really big advancements that they get by doing that. So first, obviously, we're taking the storage away from the data center. We're putting it up to the cloud where it is cheaper. Mm-hmm. Then you have that huge increased collaboration abilities, right? So now if 2 coworkers are working on a document and they're not sitting together in the same room, they can go and collaborate live and edit a document. Both people edit the same document as they're working through. So that works really, really well. It also takes the requirement away from having to be at the office to do your work, right? That's the beauty of OneDrive for Business, is it's accessible from anywhere as long as you have an authenticated account. And of course, we strongly recommend multi-factor authentication for your OneDrive for Business.
So what you're saying is that you get kind of the OneNote experience in the rest of the Office application, right? You could co-edit in the same document, you can do all those things?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. Does that apply for PowerPoint as well?
Well,
Of course.
not everybody. It's only us that really uses PowerPoint anyway. So if you're not presenting, if you're not doing a lot of slide decks, and that's actually a good point. And I'm kind of okay with PowerPoint not being live collaborative like that, because I think the traditional method of one person creating a slide deck in PowerPoint and then bringing that forward to someone else for them to review and edit is really a better process when you're building a slide deck.
Yeah, but though it's still available, right? So
Of course.
yeah. So traditionally, the task of people come like, we have this huge file server. We have shared folder. We have on home folders. So what kind of approach do you recommend customers or clients to do to migrate to SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business?
As an architect, it's kind of hard for me to give a blanket recommendation for everybody. This is how you should do things. So it really depends upon the organization themselves and what their requirements are. I'm a big PowerShell guy, especially when it comes to doing data center migrations and stuff, because I don't want the error of making a click.
Yeah.
Right? So I love PowerShell. If you know the people that are actually doing the work are able to use PowerShell and know what PowerShell is today, I'm not about to say, okay, I need to teach you PowerShell because that's what you need to do to move your data to the cloud.
That would make a lot of IT pros that's based out of the old system kind of scared out, right?
Right. If you're comfortable with GUI, the user interface, and not doing things through command line, then yeah, there are a couple of other tools out there. There are even some third-party tools as well that will automate a lot of the processes. But again, I'll still fall back to PowerShell always.
So let's talk about some of those tools. So to help out, there's this one neat tool called SharePoint Migration Tool. Have you used that one?
No, I haven't. I actually seen it for the first time yesterday.
Well, I'm happy to show you. So the neat thing about SharePoint Migration Tool is that it's a very, very user-friendly tool, and it's a rather click and select tool where well, first of all, it's free. So anyone can opt in for that.
I like free.
People tend to like free. So it's a user-friendly tool where you only, with a couple of few clicks, tend to say that, hey, I want this folder in my file system migrated to this SharePoint Online path. And for those of you who are not prone to that, OneDrive for Business is actually your personal SharePoint path in your tenant, right?
Right.
So what you got to do is you have to log into your Office 365 admin portal and take accessible ownership to that person's OneDrive for Business site, and then you actually get the SharePoint Online path and can copy and paste that into SharePoint Migration Tool. Or you can even create a CSV file to upload multiple home folders to multiple users, right? So what's your take on PowerShell then? How do you solve that with PowerShell?
Well, it's one and done, right? We're not going to one of the things I'm going to do with PowerShell is I'm going to ultimately make a blanket statement, right? We're going to move everything that's here and it's going to go there. If it needs to be taken somewhere else after that, then that's going to be a post-processing activity. Ultimately, my PowerShell job is going to be a bulk run, right? So that's great for department folders and stuff like that. Although it'll work for home folders, it's probably not the best solution to use, because I don't know about you, Alex, but a lot of my customers, if they see home drive, they think they can put their personal stuff in there.
Oh, I've seen a lot of those. A couple of months back, I had a customer, a client of mine, do that, and I spent almost a day migrating private stuff like personal videos, personal movies, and there's only so much bandwidth a company can handle. So one of the full days was actually migrating personal stuff from the network drive.
Right, and that's something that you need to really take account of, because way up in Norway like that, you don't have, as fast of a connection as we do, say, in Seattle or even Canada.
I hear you trash talking Norway here.
Well, I mean, you are pretty way up there, right?
Yeah, we truly are. So, well, let's say a typical customer approach you, Emil, and say, hey, we have like yay terabytes of data we want to migrate. Where do you start?
Really, the first thing to do is, just like any project we do, Alex, it's discovery, right?
Yep.
So what we need to do is, okay, you've got 40 terabytes of data. What is that 40 terabytes comprised of, right? Is it all internal documents? Is it home drive? What type of documents are they? And it's actually funny you mentioned that, because I've been a big OneDrive guy for about 5 years now, and I've put all of my work documents, my personal documents in OneDrive after I had a few inadvertent hard drive failures, one after the other. So I've been storing everything in OneDrive, and it's been protected up there. Now, probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago, I started migrating everything to OneDrive for Business. So I created a couple of other OneDrive for Business accounts inside of my different tenants, and I split out all of my work data from my personal OneDrive, which I pay for, to my corporate OneDrive, which I don't pay for personally. So what I've found is, I've been designing websites since '97, and I have every single website that I have ever done. Do you see where I'm going with this?
Old school. You had some problems with file names and naming standards and
Yes.
illegal characters, because OneDrive Personal supports multiple file types more than online for SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business, right?
Right.
So I guess you had some upload sync errors.
I did. I had upload sync errors, and that's when I realized that OneDrive for Business really is a SharePoint website, right? You're connecting into a SharePoint website. You are uploading your files into a website formatted repository. So you can't upload files that would change the code of your website or execute back-end scripts. And but OneDrive Personal, it does. And I found that really cool, because the two products seem very, very seamless, but really on the back end, they're very, very different.
So your personal experience with OneDrive is rather different from the business experience of OneDrive.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's probably why they call it OneDrive for Business, right?
Right.
Yeah. I had an interesting call from another customer saying, "Hey, we know you've done some home folder migration. We know that you can do some OneDrive for Business migration." And what they left out of that chat was that they already had it in a different tenant. So have you ever done a tenant-to-tenant migration?
Yes. You want to know who else left that out? Microsoft.
Oh.
There's no way to do that. Right?
Yeah.
Natively, there's no way to easily transfer your data from one tenant in OneDrive for Business to another. So you need to either look at the buys from ShareGate, or do it yourself, and ultimately you'd have to use your workstation or your server as a staging area. Now, I have done this in the past with PowerShell, so we can suck the information down out of our OneDrive for Business client to local, and then up back to the internet again. But especially, if we're in a location with limited bandwidth, why should I have to pull it out of Azure to put it back into Azure?
Absolutely true. And that is one of the probably things that we should see in SharePoint migration tool that we really need, is that they have this option called migrate from SharePoint to SharePoint Online, right? But they don't have from SharePoint Online to SharePoint Online.
Right.
So you mentioned ShareGate. Isn't that a company from where you come from?
Yeah, they're Canadian.
They're Canadians. Yeah.
Great group of people, and we've spent some time with them over the past few Ignites, and great group of people to work with.
Yeah, I've seen some of the solutions there, and one of the things that I really personally like a lot about ShareGate is that you don't have to access each and everyone's individual user account in Office 365 to click access to their OneDrive for Business. You could actually go into ShareGate and select everyone and grant access.
And
so you're done.
And that's great, because now there's no privacy concerns, right? You don't actually have to go in and say, okay, I'm going to drag this folder of pictures belonging to Joe.
Yeah. Yeah. So we mentioned doing a discovery. One of the things that come to mind is a harvester, right? You run a tractor, you pull in everything, you harvest in, right? You got to figure out what's in there. You have corn, you have oats, what do you got? So it's just a huge harvest, right? So how do you start that evaluation?
Well, I mean, ultimately it takes through, so we can go through scanning processes, right, to look at file extensions, determine what the organization requires to move. So one of the things that I always keep in the back of my mind is that what's junk to us may be very, very important to the organization. We were doing a data migration for an organization a few years ago, and we automatically excluded MP3 files, right? Because MP3 files are what people use for their music on their machine, you know, while they're working. If you want to keep them, but I'm not going to migrate them. Come to find out, 2 weeks after the project closed, that marketing stored all of their marketing commercials in MP3 files. So we had actually crippled a big part of that organization because they had a large marketing department.
Yeah, so pretty much the old saying, know thy user, for thy user is not thee, is still valid, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So one of the things that we've also thrown out is that you mentioned your 1997 websites. So there's some file extensions that's invalid in OneDrive for Business. So you should do some PowerShell scripting and rather gather information from your shared folder or home folder and see what kind of files is going to give me problem syncing. These ones are literally not supported. These are files that's larger than 20 gigabytes. These are files that's larger than this and that. That might help you figure out which is going to give me problems. These are going to break the migration. And then you could also identify and discover, even though MP3 files are supported, you misjudge them as private files.
Exactly.
So by doing that discovery, you might have like, do you really want those MP3 files? And by saying yay or nay, you could do another day of migration or not. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So what are some of the other files, Alex, that you can't transfer up to OneDrive for Business?
Oh, there are some folders like _VTM.
Okay, which is a back-end website folder.
Yeah, there should be like a couple of those files, and you can find those at the blog for the OneDrive team, okay. And those are frequently updated so that you are kept up to speed on what kind of files you're allowed to do. And they recently removed the limitation on percentage icon. And the reason why the percentage icon is super important is every file you download from the web containing a space is automatically replaced by %20. Oh. So whenever you've done in the past, you downloaded a lot of PDF, a lot of files that have been uploaded with the FTP file transfer protocol application that did support the space, it automatically renamed them to something %20. Once downloaded again, it replaced them to the %20. It allowed to store it on the file system, not on OneDrive for Business. That was something that was added last year. So those things are continuously being developed and supported. So take a look and see what's supported now. But more interesting is the GDPR. Have you had a lot of business doing with GDPR?
I have not. I've had a lot. I mean, I'm Canadian, right? And a lot of the organizations that I work with are oil and gas. They're pretty strictly, tightly controlled to even Alberta. So outside of the large international organizations where I normally do, Windows deployments and stuff like that, the small time, it's more of an interest for us. What is GDPR? Because on our side of the pond, GDPR is not a popular comment, right? It's not something that you hear about all the time. There was a big wave last year around Ignite for about 3 weeks, and then everybody forgot about it. Yep. So not a big uptake right now, but I also haven't, I don't know of any clients of mine that have had requests from European residents that needed their data removed.
So I had an interesting take here, and that was a customer who wanted to migrate to SharePoint Online and OneDrive for Business. And there was this one person at the department who got all the resumes, people who filled in for jobs and those kind of things. All of a sudden, he had 15-year-old resumes laying around. Wow. And GDPR says that if you have personal information, it should be up-to-date personal information. If it's obsolete, you should go out and make sure that it's updated. Otherwise, it got to go.
Now, what's obsolete? Is there a time limit as to what the data is obsolete that you know of?
Well, in the case I get married, that's one flag that's going to be obsolete, right?
Okay.
So there's of course there's a trade-off there, right? If you fill in for a job and you hand in your resume and you go married next day, it's not like they can pull your job employment, right? So what they do is like find the middle way there. Okay. But of course, having 15-year-old resume is probably not a good thing. And one of the interesting thing about doing the discovery is that we say, hey, these files, you have to delete them. And we find that people don't delete data. You have your own websites from 1997, right?
Yep.
Yeah. So when was the last time you really deleted an email? Or do you still have email from 1997?
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you read them very often?
No. But every now and then, I do actually go back and go do a research, especially if it's something around the technology that I was working with at the time, because I'll guarantee you I've forgotten more than I've remembered.
Yeah.
Right?
But are we still talking the 90s? Really?
I guess from a web design perspective, yes, right? But also, I find myself going back to the old DOS days more and more often now, especially with PowerShell becoming more prevalent. We like to do a lot of things inside of the command line now. And the little tips and tricks that we used to use back in the day, like dir/w, right? Nobody remembers what that does anymore.
Nope.
And these little tricks that we've lost over the years, I like to go back and kind of refresh myself, because especially when you're working in something like, Windows Server Core, those little DOS commands become really, really helpful when you're diagnosing issues.
Yeah. And it sounds like for me, you're mentioning, okay, we need to get back to some of those information. Okay, so we identify some of those data, some of those files that we want to migrate because we actually have use for them, right? But then it's kind of me, if I were to talk to your wife, I expect to find a box of old cables. We might...
Well, no, she's going to tell you I'm a hoarder. So I'm a hoarder of data, I'm a hoarder of cables, right? It's going to happen.
Be a big box of cables, right? We might have this old cable come to use anytime, right? But those might actually be stored to a boneyard. So let's say if you migrate a lot of information from your file server to OneDrive for Business, to SharePoint Online, there's still a lot of data that is still kind of important, but they're never used or frequently used. So you can just shut off your server.
Okay, kind of like nearline storage, they call it.
Nearline storage. So just turn it off, and it's your boneyard. It's just like if it's gone, it's gone. Nobody starts crying, but it's not like you're actively taking care and making sure that that data is important for the company, like flagging and say, hey, if we lose this, we lose our business. But it's need to have in case if something comes up, right?
Yeah, and full disclosure, I probably haven't went back to my emails in a 3 years, so that would be a good use case for that kind of stuff, yeah.
And for those of you who'd like to see that, there are some blogs from Olav Tvedt that really gives you that file analysis and gives you the full spectrum of what files that would give you problems and what files that you probably don't want to see in your OneDrive for Business, not because you don't want them in your OneDrive for Business, but because you don't want to spend 2, 3, 4 days migrating those things, right?
Right.
Yeah.
But now we still need to make sure that data is protected.
Yeah.
Right? So even if we're going to keep that on-prem and we're moving everything else off-prem to OneDrive or to SharePoint Online, we still need to keep some kind of redundancy or some kind of backup for that data, because unfortunately it's the 21st century and ransomware is a real thing now for everybody.
Oh, sadly it is. We've been talking a lot about OneDrive for Business, SharePoint. Should we clarify once more what's what? So OneDrive for Business is your personal home folder. It's a replacement for your personal stuff, right? And SharePoint Online is
document collaboration for your team, for your organization.
Yeah. So what you see is that OneDrive for Business is a SharePoint Online site, but it's your personal stuff.
Right, but there's a good blend there, because I will create something and I will save it in my OneDrive for Business. A couple of days later, I'm going to want to share that document with one of my colleagues. So traditionally, of course, we would have to, zip that file up and email it or send a link or something. And that's really where OneDrive for Business kind of bridges that gap between corporate home drive and corporate team drive.
Oh, that's neat. That's a neat aspect to it. And take on that. You mentioned back in the days you had to right-click, zip down, send files, and you ended up with a situation where, did you read that document I sent you? Well, I did, but then some other guy said, but I updated it, and you didn't get the last updated.
Version conflicts.
Version conflicts. So what takes is on return on investment on SharePoint Online on that?
Especially from a time investment of repeated work. or even just collaborative effort, it's good because you know that there's not necessarily only one version of the file, because you can have, reversions, and you can go back to the file from yesterday or from last week if somebody made a change that you don't like or deleted the file. But the version of the file that's accessible to everybody is the most recent copy. And that's the beauty of a cloud stored document, of course.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier, a little while back, you did some file copying by using PowerShell. It was pretty much just basic move files from here to there. And you mentioned some of those old DOS commands, like dir-w. One of the things that might be interesting to look into is Robocopy.
Robocopy is still a great tool.
Yeah, and the interesting part about Robocopy is that you could actually take and say, hey, you have a network drive, it's populated with data, I want that to be copied to your percentage user folder / company OneDrive for business folder, and then copy all of those data from the client, make the client do the work and the load, copy the data from the network drive to the OneDrive for business folder, and then take the pace and time to migrate up to OneDrive for business for you. So there's two takes on that. One is using Robocopy to move. That way you're gonna free up space from your file server. So let's say you're gonna free up some space and do that. You can do Robocopy and move. Make sure that you have backup running on that system, because if the OneDrive for Business sync is incomplete and something happens to the computer, you're in trouble.
Well, and the other thing too, Alex, is when especially one of the cool things about Robocopy is as you're copying the file, you can modify the file permissions. Right? So your source file on your file server is going to have NTFS permissions applied to it that restrict what users can access the data. When we migrate that to SharePoint Online, it's a whole different process. So we don't need those NTFS permissions there anymore. We don't want those NTFS permissions there anymore. So we'll strip those out as we're migrating up to SharePoint Online. But we need to have a copy to say this is what it was like before we sent it up. This is who had access before we sent it up.
So the move is to free up space, and then you have the copy. You can copy the files from the network share to your OneDrive folder. Then there's a active backup in case something happens to your files while they're being synced. The benefit about doing this is that you're not having a consultant or anyone come in and actually sitting and clicking and doing all the migration for you, or you have one of your IT staff having to see the progress bar snailing away. It's like hamster wheels when you're doing terabytes and terabytes of data. By doing the Robocopy, you could have copying the files to your client. When they take their client back home, they have a whole new bandwidth. So you have actually spread the load from your server to all your peers.
Right, and that's actually pretty important because a lot of organizations, especially smaller mom and pop shops, or even sub 5,000, are more lax than a large enterprise on what data is stored on their network. And a lot of companies are okay with you storing, your family summer photos on your home drive.
What, you tell me you're not doing that?
Guilty. But my point is that, especially in your situation, Alex, where you regularly struggle with limited bandwidth, when you come in as a consultant, you can't really justify billing your time out to move somebody's personal data, but you are there to move the corporate stuff. So this will allow you to kind of put that segregation of roles and say, okay, I'm going to take care of all the stuff you work with. If you want to do that, you go home and you can upload that yourselves.
Yeah, that's true. So the benefit about doing this is that your corporate network might be a couple of hundred megabit, and then it's fine. Moving data to the client with a Robocopy script, and then take your laptop home, it would continue the progress. And if you, in the script, shut down the connection to the network drive, there's not going to be any editing of the critical files, right? So there's not going to be any version conflicts on the previous environment towards the new OneDrive for Business of SharePoint Online, right? So we talk about regulations. You have some financial regulations and you have some insurance regulations, right? You have to ensure that the data is kept for at least a couple of years, right? So what's the situation in Canada?
Typically, anything from a corporate perspective, like finance related, needs to be stored for 7 years, and that's for the tax man. Right? In case you get audited, you need to be able to provide a full history of ultimately everything that you spent for the last 7 years. Depending on organizations, health records, for example, a lot of the health organizations keep documentation perpetually, right? Because the fact that I got a concussion 20 years ago when I was watching hockey, because I don't play hockey, could be important if I came in, to the hospital now with another concussion.
Yeah.
Right? So
for watching soccer.
Exactly, from watching soccer.
Yeah.
So that information is very critical to healthcare. So depending upon organizations, small organizations, private companies, a lot of them have unlimited retention. So they're kind of like me. From the day I started work, I've saved everything, right?
So the different aspect of this, if you have a system, like a corporate system, a healthcare system, that retains those files for you, it's not the typical shared folder or home folder solution. It's more like your Word documents, your Excel spreadsheets, it's your PowerPoints, etc., right?
Yeah, or it's data stored in a database.
Yeah, and typically what you're going to find is that once you say, hey, we want to move them from on-prem to SharePoint Online, someone's going to say, but what about retention?
Right.
So how do you solve retention?
Well, that's the beauty of Azure, right? As long as you've got the pocketbook, you can keep stuff up there as long as you want. So a lot of the new solutions now have 99-year retention policies, and hopefully I don't live that long. But if I do, then I'll still going to have my websites, right?
The 1997 is still going to be valid in
2097.
Yeah. Oh, that's going to be neato.
Or 2096, I guess.
Yeah. And we're talking about what about version conflicts? I frequently get the people from on-prem world say, what about backup? If someone deletes a file in Office 365,
what about backup?
What about backup? Yeah, that's right.
What about backup?
Yeah.
Right? We don't need it. That's the beauty of Azure.
Yeah.
Right? The whole idea of taking your data center and shifting it up to somebody else who knows how to do it better, right? That's what this is all about.
Yeah.
So once we have the documentation up in Azure, Microsoft is backing that stuff up.
Yeah.
So from an interface perspective, what we're able to do is kind of like shadow copies, right? Back in Windows. We can go right click on the file and go back to previous versions.
That's true. And also you have that restore version history in OneDrive for Business that keeps your files vivid for like 93 days.
Sure. Yeah.
So you have a first level recycle bin for 31 days, and then it's moved to second level recycle bin in case of deletion. So
for 31 days, and then that's where the 93 days come from.
Yeah. So it's like 3 months, but there's no consecutively 3 months of 31 days, but they just made sure in Office 365 that's the standard.
Okay.
So yeah, make sure that every month have 31 days. So there's never going to be any change.
You're never going to be low.
Yeah, you're never going to go low. So, what about cleanup? Have you ever done any cleanup? Like I mentioned, the old resumes, right?
Yeah.
Have you ever seen like a whole? You mentioned MP3 files, right?
Yeah.
That was incorrectly not uploaded.
Yeah.
Have you seen any other major cases?
No, that was the biggest one that sticks into my mind. Cleanup is not something that I will typically do as a consultant, because at the end of the day, I don't know what your data is. I just know that it's important. Mm-hmm. So my job is to make sure that I move what you tell me to move up to SharePoint Online or up to Azure, and make sure that it's accessible once it gets up there. If you don't want it moved or you want it taken care of, that's typically not my realm. So no, I've got nothing there.
But if a customer says that everything's important, we need to move everything, that's when your consultancy comes in, right? And say, hey, you don't want to move everything.
Well, yeah, I mean, I've got to justify my bill rate at some point, right? So I'm going to, educate them, cautiously and say, is this really what you want to do? And try and, educate on the implications of moving a mass amount of data like that.
Yeah. One of the things that I really enforce customers to do and emphasize on is restructuring your data. So we talked about SharePoint Online and we talked about OneDrive for Business, like primarily, right? And one of the neat thing here is that OneDrive for Business is your home folder.
Right.
You see a home folder network drive, that's your OneDrive for Business. It's being migrated, easy peasy. Now, when it comes to shared folders, there's a whole bunch of things you can do. You have SharePoint Online just as a file repository, right? And then you have Office groups, and you have Microsoft Teams. So what I try to educate the companies about is that, is this a department-wide network share, or is this across, like cross-linking between different organizations in your company? So what I would emphasize on is that if you have HR, human resources, that is typically something you want to create a Teams channel on, because they have to chat, they have to communicate, they have to collaborate, and they need to have a place to store their files. Yeah. But otherwise, like IT, would probably be the same thing. For other departments, let's say someone that only needs for a project, they don't need that full intense collaboration because it's a subset of a team.
Like the PMO office.
For instance, right? It might be that just this subset of people are using those files. It might be a SharePoint related site, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, I think that restructuring of the data is probably the most important point that you've brought up throughout the whole presentation, right? Getting it up there from an infrastructure guide, that's the easy part. But once you get it up there, you need to make sure that it's structured. There's a lot of cool new methods inside of SharePoint for organizing your data. Things like tags, right? And even just the proper folder structure and the way that you name them is absolutely critical to finding that data. And I don't know about you, but data drift has been absolutely huge in almost all of my customers. And no two file shares are organized the same way.
That's absolutely true. And the reason why restructuring is important as well is because you want your information users, your clients, your end users to start adopting to these new products. And when they find that I used to find my files in a network share, I don't know where they are. I spent 30 seconds to find them last week. Now I had to spend 15 minutes. You get frustrated end users.
Yeah.
So
and you want to go back to the old way.
Having restructured everything make sense for the end user. Yeah. That is really where you're...
And especially as you start to implement new things like Teams and start to look at, Delve and the other Office 365 products, right?
Definitely. So take on that. I would thank you so much, Emil, for having me sitting here, having you interviewed.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. This was fun. It was great.
Yeah, it was fun. Right, thanks.
Yeah, thanks, everyone.